Benchmarks are great to get a view of the overall market. It's a great way to talk about the market. The market is up or down, compare one market to another, but they're not a good guide for investing because they reflect the group thinking. As you know, indices are based on market capitalization, and market capitalization is based on price. In other words, if you've got a higher price, the market cap goes up, and they have a heavier weighting in the index. So you've got to be very careful that you don't follow the index all the time and make independent decisions.
Well, it's a necessary evil, let's say it this way. It's good to measure and to have a benchmark in order to assess how good you're doing the way you said to do. But the thing is simply, what frustrates me is simply when the benchmarks drive investment decisions. And also, to the extent that benchmarks exist, they have their own flaws, and it's good to be aware of and mindful of benchmarks. It's to become benchmark aware and not benchmark driven. They are necessary, but not always in the way we use them.
I think the industry needs to move towards customer-oriented solutions. The problem with most providers today, I mean, we're stuck in an industry where we have to oscillate around a benchmark. At the end of the day, what clients want is they want a return and they want protection on the downside. If you're all oscillating around a benchmark, you're not actually giving a client what they're looking for. So I think benchmarks, really, I don't think they're relevant.
Benchmarks is a very complex subject, and clearly from a reference point of view, benchmarks are very useful. But I think we're in a world now where we're evolving, and more traditional industry benchmarks are less relevant to everyday investors who are, in a sense, struggling to manage their own personal asset liability mix. So I think what we'll see is an evolution of benchmarks to much more hybrid and, in some cases, personalized benchmarks for investors, which will be of greater relevance to them.
I think generally benchmarks are obviously useful. They do set they do give you a certain reference point, and I think in the asset management industry those are more developed. I think they're also easier to establish because you have a certain defined set of data. In the operational arena, I think that benchmarks probably become a bit more qualitative because the sets of data that are available are not as homogeneous. The operational data would be more influenced by specific scenarios that you're working in, and hence would not be as comparable sometimes. I think they are a good starting points. They are usually sort of an average, so an average is okay to be looking at. But of course, if you really want to excel at what you're doing, then you would use them once, and then you would move on from there, wanting to be at the top of the range and not necessarily somewhere around the benchmark.
Benchmarks are really interesting, right? Because they actually point to the past, and sometimes that doesn't mean that it allows us to invent the future. So we can say, oh, that's not standard benchmark, but what that's really just saying is we're looking historically. And business leaders today, all leaders today, have to do one thing that's absolutely so hard to do, which is they have to both manage the present and invent the future. And looking backwards doesn't very much help that situation. So proving, gosh, it hasn't been done before is not really a good reason not to do it, and try new things.
Is a very important issue. Every fund should have an appropriate benchmark, and a benchmark allows performance to be measured, attributed, and allows for the professional construction of portfolios based upon the process by which the portfolio manager effectively tries to capture either his alpha or, in the case of ETFs, his beta. So I am someone who is obviously a strong believer in well-constructed benchmarks. However, I'm also someone who believes that in the markets where I operate, which is frontier markets, off-benchmark emerging market, that benchmarks effectively have to be treated with caution. Because in our markets, if something is illiquid, it's not included in an index. If something has market access, it's not included in an index. So this is where the passive manager and the active manager differs. And so to me, effectively in our space, the frontier space, I don't manage my portfolios based on the benchmark, but what I do is I make sure that we deliver the excess return in the long run so that people get what they want rather than what the benchmark is there to measure.
Simply, benchmarks are what they say. It's comparing a fund's performance against a benchmark, and obviously the downside to that is if a benchmark falls in value over a period in time, you might have beaten the benchmark, but you've lost the overall amount of money that's been deposited. So what I think the market wants today is absolute return on money invested, so capital preservation and ideally a revenue from that. And so that's been the general trend away from benchmarks towards capital preservation and absolute return.